Hello, I'm Ashley Frank, Principal Consultant at Compliance Services International. And on behalf of the FIFRA Endangered Species Task Force, I'm going to be exploring the topic of an Endangered Species Act term reasonably certain to occur, as it pertains to evaluating the potential effects from pesticides on species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. This term, reasonably certain to occur, recently was clarified in the promulgated ESA language, and I'm going to take you through the definition of this term, factors that were added in this recent clarification that should be considered when making a determination of certitude, and how tools and data that have been aggregated by the FIFRA Endangered Species Task Force can inform the determination of certainty when it's related to potential effects of pesticides on ESA listed species. I'd like to thank my co-authors, Tillman Hall of Bear Crop Science, who is the technical chair of FESTF, and Robin Carlton from Valent, who is the administrative co-chair of FESTF. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 includes a section for interagency cooperation. This is Section 7, and it ensures that all activities that are authorized, funded, or carried out by any federal agency do not jeopardize the continued existence of species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act or result in destruction or adverse modification of their designated critical habitats. All federal agencies must consult with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service to ensure that any such activities are not likely to cause impacts. So in the picture here, the building of this bridge by the federal agency would have gone through a Section 7 consultation if there were endangered species found within the vicinity, the immediate vicinity here of this site. The Fish and Wildlife and NOAA Fisheries are jointly responsible for carrying out this act. Fish and Wildlife is responsible for terrestrial and freshwater species, and NMFS is responsible for marine species and fish such as salmon. So during a Section 7 consultation, the Fish and Wildlife and/or NMFS formulate a biological opinion. And this is a document that lays out the information on which an opinion about the impacts from the action is based. It includes a description of the action being proposed by the federal agency, defines the area involved in the action, identifies and describes the species and critical habitat in that action area, describes the status of the species and the environmental baseline, and then provides a detailed analysis that analyzes the effects of the action on listed species or critical habitat. And it's really in this analysis of this effects of action where the consideration of whether consequences of an activity might be reasonably certain to occur as a result of the proposed action. So it's in this analysis of the effects of the action where it's really the meat of this opinion. The final outcome of the biological opinion is an ESA Effect Determination of whether the action is likely or not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of the species or result in destruction or adverse modification of the critical habitat. And if we look a little deeper into this analysis where the effects of the proposed action are evaluated, this is taken from 50 CFR 402, and there were changes that were recently made to the definition here, which are important to our discussion. The clarifications were made to provide specific factors for action agencies and the services to use when evaluating the effects of a proposed action. And when evaluating the effects of a proposed action, in order to make a determination that an action is going to result in jeopardy or adverse modification, it must be based on firm, clear, and substantial information. And it must be based on the best scientific and commercial data that are available at the time of making that evaluation. And there must be a degree of certitude that the action will result in such effects, so it can't be based on speculation or conjecture. The regulation then provides some further information about these factors to consider when making a determination. So the factors that a consequence is caused by a proposed action can be based on past experiences, existing plans for the activity, and any remaining economic, administrative, and legal requirements that might be necessary for the activity to proceed. The determination that a consequence is not caused by the proposed action include, but are not limited to, if the consequence is so remote in time from the action that it's not reasonably certain to occur, or that it is so geographically remote from the immediate area involved in the action, or only reached through a lengthy causal chain that involves so many steps as to make that consequence not reasonably certain to occur. Pesticides come into play here because the registration or re-registration of a pesticide is considered a federal action. The Environmental Protection Agency is responsible for authorizing the registration and re-registration of pesticides under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act. The pesticide label is what defines that action being authorized. And the FIFRA ESA interplay presents many challenges that are not realized really in any other types of consultations, because many of the other consultations that are conducted under Section 7 are on a very site-specific level. So thinking back to the bridge example that we looked at earlier, that's very site-specific, and there is an immediate area around that site that can be evaluated. However, the registration of a pesticide is typically national, and so it provides a much larger scope and a lot of challenges to this FIFRA ESA process. To help address some of the challenges of conducting national level consultations, in March of this year, EPA published a document that outlined revised methods for conducting evaluations of pesticides on ESA listed species. It is a three-step process. The first two are included in EPA's assessment, which is called a biological assessment. This assessment is conducted on the individual and field level and results in the determination for each listed species and designated critical habitats as no effect or may affect. Those that are may affect then enter into the third step of the process, which is conducted by the National Marine Fisheries and Fish and Wildlife Service. This is the biological opinion and is conducted at the population and landscape or watershed scale. The outcome of this is an ESA determination of jeopardy or no jeopardy. The mere scope of a national level endangered species pesticide assessment is what makes it challenging. A national level pesticide registration can bring in hundreds of ESA listed species and their designated critical habitats that need to be evaluated. Each of those species have their own habitat and diet and other life history components that make them unique. There's also what's known about the pesticide, its application timing and methods and its toxicity, as well as where the pesticide is going to be used and the agricultural system that is in play. Combined with information that we know is going on at the field level or at the end user level, there are various conservation activities that are being implemented and best management practices. All of this information feeds into the determination of certainty. Considering this wealth of information that should feed into the determination of certainty of effects, it's clear that without a way to aggregate and deliver these data in a usable way, it's almost impossible to have these components realized in the certainty determination. The FIFRA Endangered Species Task Force was formed in 1996 with the purpose of fulfilling a data requirement to supply EPA with information related to the proximity of ESA-listed species to pesticide use sites. Since 1996, we've been working with various types of data that relate to endangered species and pesticides, and we've really learned that it is necessary to have a data integration tool. We built an information management system in early 2000s, and we recently developed a new generation called Gopher to bring a spatial platform and flexibility to this national level process. And Gopher does so in a well-documented and transparent manner. Since its formation, FSTF has been aggregating data, which include the best available scientific and commercial data, to develop these clear and substantial determinations of whether consequences from pesticide uses are reasonably certain to occur. Our aggregated data sets include spatial and tabular data representing where the location of pesticide use sites may be, including crop and non-crop areas. These include publicly available data sets from USDA and USGS, as well as a licensed data set from American Digital Cartography. We also have spatial and tabular data representing the locations of ESA-listed species and their designated critical habitats, from publicly available data from Fish and Wildlife and NOAA Fisheries, as well as licensed data from the conservation organization NatureServe. We also maintain species attributes in the form of status of species files, which were compiled under the direct supervision of Fish and Wildlife. Thinking back to those components that inform a biological opinion, after the action has been described, the next component is to define the action area. And how that action area is defined is very important because it then sets the stage for the remainder of the analysis. So in the case of pesticide uses, the action area can be defined as where the labeled uses are located and the area where the pesticide might transport from the application site via environmental processes, via drift or runoff. Spatial data exist and are housed in Gopher to identify where these labeled use sites are potentially located, such as illustrated on the national map for corn in the United States. But these data are only representative, and they're not definitive of where pesticide applications are actually going to occur. There are inherent data limitations to spatial data sets. For example, there could be misclassifications in the spatial data of what was once a cornfield could now be a subdivision, as shown in the example on the right. So it's important that these limitations are factored into the analysis of certainty of a pesticide application causing impact to the ESA-listed species. And notice that these action area considerations occur in the steps leading up to analyzing the effects of the action. After the action area is defined, the next component of a biological opinion is to identify the species and designated critical habitats that are found within that action area. But how do you define where a species is located? Is it all of the locations where the species has been recorded? Is it just the current locations? Is it all potential habitat? Or is it some variation of these? The answer to that question is really going to change which species are considered in an action area and which are considered outside of an action area. The example here is for the Cape Fear Shiner, and the map on the left is from the ECOS species profile from Fish and Wildlife, and the map on the right is distribution data from the Southeast Office of Fish and Wildlife. And you can see using these different types of data will impact if the species is considered in the action area or not in the action area. FSTF maintains aggregated species location data. One of those is a licensed data set from NatureServe with occurrences of ESA-listed species. These occurrences need to be considered into that evaluation of certainty because they inform which species are considered in the action area and which are considered outside of the action area. Furthermore, the amount of action area that is found in a species location and where that overlap occurs is a component that should inform the certainty of a consequence from a pesticide action happening. There could be a lot of overlap between a potential pesticide use area, but there could be a physical barrier between the use site and the species locations that make off-site transport of the pesticide off the field very unlikely and uncertain to cause a consequence to a species. Similarly, the consideration of how water moves within a watershed also factors into if a consequence is going to happen. FSTF is working on enhancements to gopher that are going to allow these types of overlap calculations to be available. So after the action area is defined and species are identified that are in the action area, the next step is to describe the species status in the environmental baseline. Gopher houses status of species information for all listed species, and it includes information related to the current status and range details of each species. It also includes location-specific information from NatureServe as well as from publicly available sources that pull information on where the species are distributed throughout the range and what the condition of those species are. The status of the species information in gopher also contains data related to the species habitat. This can provide information about the certainty that a pesticide could even reach the habitat, such as a forested habitat of a species in relation to a pesticide used in golf courses, for example. The information in gopher also houses information on population, threats and stressors, recovery, and other data. So when combined together and feeding into the analysis of the effects of the action, combining what we know about the species with where the species is located in relation to that action area leads to the identification of where those pesticide applications and or exposures are so geographically remote from the immediate area involved that consequences are not reasonably certain to occur. And if you think back, this is one of those factors leading to the opinion of a no consequence. Similarly, there are components in gopher of the species habitat and behavior that can identify when these consequences from the use of a pesticide are so remote in time from the action that they are not reasonably certain to occur. So it could be that a particular life stage of an insect is in diapause during the time that an application is going to be made of a pesticide. And there are also a lot of information on prior evaluations that can be used to factor into the evaluation of certainty. And using these past experiences with activities that have resulted from actions that are similar in scope, nature, and magnitude is one of the factors that feeds into. And gopher can provide this information and can be used to track these prior consultations to make use of these past experiences. Another component and factor of analyzing effects is, are there existing plans for the activity? There are a lot of current agricultural and conservation practices that provide a baseline of the activity area. So there are existing plans for that activity. There are things in place, best management practices, enrollment areas, adoption, historical usage data. These existing plans, these existing activities that feed into certainty. If, for example, there is an area where there has not been any existing use or prior use of a particular pesticide, then the future use of that pesticide might not provide the certainty needed. So all of these factors come together to develop an effects determination. And if the best scientific and commercial data are available, along with what we know about existing plans, past experience, do not provide that degree of certitude that a consequence is going to happen, then the effects determination should be no jeopardy. And I've provided there in the table just a few example factors and details that would lead to that uncertainty that a consequence would happen. So if our proposed action is, for example, the re-registration of a pesticide in soybeans, and we have a species whose range overlaps the action area, but we look at the actual occurrences of those, and they do not overlap the action area. And we know from the status of that species that it's in diapause when the pesticide is applied. The habitat does not include agricultural fields, and pesticides are not listed as a stressor. And we know there are existing vegetative buffers along waterways that help prevent pesticides from reaching the habitat. And prior consultations have resulted in no jeopardy and no history of prior chemical use. All of these factors can be combined together to inform that certitude or lack of certitude that a consequence could be occurring. I'd like to thank you very much for this opportunity, and I've provided my contact information there in hopes that if you have any questions or follow-ups that you will not hesitate to contact me. Thank you.